Professor Goldberg.
I'd like to point out, I think I should say in the traditions of the Senate, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, I'll take it. Thanks, Ken, and thanks, Jim, and Boston University. And I also wanted to take the opportunity to thank Professor Dworkin for being a patient and brilliant instructor back when I was a law student many years ago. Needless to say, if anything in the following performance is a failure, it is my personal responsibility and not his. As this conference attests, Dworkin's magnificent writings cover an astonishing amount of territory. Yet, for all their breadth, they tend to display certain common features, two of which I wish to emphasize. The first is substantive. Throughout Dworkin's corpus, one finds an unwavering and unapologetic defense of an egalitarian form of liberalism. Second feature might be called methodological or perhaps rhetorical. Dworkin's writings frequently deploy an absorptive mode of argument. Confronted with an opposing view, he is apt to offer a claim of the following form. Look, I realize that you believe yourself to be defending a view contrary to mine, but a careful analysis of the terms on which you have articulated your position reveals that you are in fact committed to mine. In these remarks, I will consider both features as they play out in Justice for Hedgehogs. In particular, I will invoke them in aid of a partial explanation as to why and how responsibility concepts have come to loom larger in his more recent writings. My suggestions is that Hedgehogs gives pride of place to notions of ethical and moral responsibility, partly as an absorptive response to familiar and politically salient critiques that have been leveled against egalitarian liberalisms by conservatives, or Texans as they were dubbed this morning. My further suggestion is that Dworkin's invocations of responsibility run the risk of validating rather than absorbing these criticisms. I concede, however, that this is merely one interpretation of the book, and one that may well be wrong-headed. If so, perhaps it will at least help Dworkin by allowing him to anticipate future misinterpretations. Let me begin with a very brief detour into contemporary American politics. A notable feature, I think, of the Obama presidency has been his emphasis on personal responsibility. Indeed, no less authoritative a source than the official White House blog identifies personal responsibility as one of two pillars of the president's approach to politics. In both his inauguration speech and his much-discussed speech to students this past September, the president took great pains to emphasize the importance of personal responsibility, both with respect to the responsibility of an individual to herself and to others to make something of her life. Why this focus? Well, I think Mr. Obama is eager to distance himself from a form of liberalism, perhaps one more imagined than real, that for some time has been the object of conservative attacks. Indeed, a dominant refrain in contemporary conservatism, whether Burkean, libertarian, or evangelical, has been to attack a view called liberalism, cast as an elitist ideology that embraces self-indulgence and irresponsibility. Disproportionately favored by professional academics and other overeducated segments of the population, liberals are accused of displaying excessive faith in the ability of technocrats and our life-tenured judges to improve our lives for us. At the same time, liberals are supposedly prone to dismiss patriotism and religious piety as manifestations of ignorance. They also encourage a self-absorbed focus on individual wants to the exclusion of family and community commitments. They treat criminals as products of unfortunate circumstances in need of understanding and assistance rather than culpable actors deserving of punishment. And they are insufficiently willing to credit individuals as responsible for their achievements and too willing, therefore, to treat wealth as a common asset. Obviously, I am painting with a very broad brush here, and for that matter, a very loud palette. And I should make clear that in reciting these criticisms, I do not mean to endorse them. Instead, I wish only to observe that these sort of criticisms are now familiar, and they have seemed to have struck a chord with many Americans. In turn, they have helped to induce contemporary liberals, including, I believe, President Obama, to emphasize the degree to which their brand of liberalism is responsive to these critiques. 21st century liberalism, the president seems to insist, is a form of liberalism that takes seriously both rights and responsibilities. Justice for Hedgehogs, I would humbly suggest, reflects something of the same intellectual and political climate. To be sure, it has many other axes to grind, and it continues to rely on the language of rights, liberties, and equal concern and respect. Yet one of its most distinctive features is the extent to which it ties its defense of egalitarian liberalism to the idea that each of us bears an ethical responsibility to live well, and the related idea that this ethical responsibility dovetails with the personal and political moral responsibilities one owes to others. Here, I believe we are confronting another of Dworkin's absorptive arguments. If it is responsibility that matters to you, he seems to be saying, then you are with me. Suppose there is something to this reconstruction of the argument. I wish now to consider some pitfalls that might be associated with it. As I've already noted, a central claim of Hedgehogs is that each of us bears a responsibility to live well, that is, to live a life characterized by dignity. This responsibility is in the first instance ethical, but it also has a moral dimension. We owe it to ourselves and to others. Dignity, in turn, incorporates, as we've heard, principles of both self-respect and authenticity. To live in a self-respecting manner is to recognize that one's life has objective importance and to take it seriously as a performative opportunity. However, not just any performance will suffice. We are told that a person who chooses to devote his life to collecting matchbook covers, or for that matter, to amassing wealth, fails to pursue worthwhile activities. He degrades himself. To live authentically requires that one identify for oneself and embrace in a suitably reflective manner the activities at which one will try to succeed, with an eye toward the formation of a coherent narrative for living. A life successfully devoted to a calling, no matter how worthy, is a life without dignity if one has not embraced that calling. Dworkin's arresting conception of ethical responsibility raises many questions. At the most general level, one wants to know whether it really succeeds in its attempt to synthesize an existentialist conception of life as a freely chosen, authentic performance with two profoundly anti-existentialist notions. First, that there are metrics apart from choice and authenticity by which to gauge the value of different kinds of life performances. And second, that living well is the performance of a duty as opposed to an act of courage. My present inquiry, however, is narrower. I want to ask whether the idea of an ethical responsibility to live well threatens to validate conservative fears about the elitism and self-absorption of a certain kind of liberal. Is the responsibility to live well the sort of responsibility that only a liberal could love? Well, everything's going to hinge on how the responsibility to live well is fleshed out, insofar as it is meant to refer to something closer to a virtue, an admirable characteristic, then it seems unthreatening and uncontentious. But it also seems unable to do the work that I think Dworkin wants it to do in the course of his argument. This is why I take it Dworkin treats the responsibility to live well as a genuine requirement. A person who is in a position to live her life with dignity, yet spends it collecting matchbook covers, is not merely someone who should feel regret about a missed opportunity, nor one at which onlookers might lament. Hers is a life lacking in self-respect, a life that warrants self-loathing and condemnation. According to Dworkin, this person has not merely underperformed, she has failed at her appointed assignment, the most basic and fundamental human assignment, the assignment of living. And for this failure, she is answerable not only to herself, but to others. They may justly criticize her for her failure, for her undignified way of life. Now, Hedgehogs, not surprisingly, given its scope, leaves vague the contours of the ethical responsibility to live well. But this also means that the text is open to an interpretation according to which it provides grounds for condemning as failures an astonishing number of human lives. Everything will depend in part on the list of unworthy pursuits and on what counts as an authentic pursuit. And in the spirit of Professor Sen remarks, I want to introduce some more characters, although I don't have names for them. I should have thought of names. Imagine a young man who, following in the footsteps of his father and his father's father, becomes a plumber who does his job competently and spends his weekend playing with his children, maintaining his house and watching sports on TV. Although it would be an overstatement to say that he has merely fallen into his life, it would also be an overstatement to say that he has self-consciously constructed it for himself, or that he has self-consciously endorsed it. Next, imagine a life of quiet piety, one lived peaceably, pleasurably, and charitably on terms set by the dictates of habit and custom. Now envision a person who takes the only employment available to her in her locality and who performs well enough to keep from getting fired. She could be more attentive to her job, to her children, to other facets of her life, but she muddles through and does okay. Are these lives lacking in dignity? Are they inauthentic lives, lives without self-respect? If so, the responsibility to live well that Dworkin identifies strikes me as too demanding to be plausible. None of these people seem to me ripe for condemnation on the ground that they have breached a duty to live their lives well. None of them seem undignified. By the same token, I believe Dworkin's account, if it in fact points in this direction, is vulnerable to conservative charges of elitism. Now, in fairness, I should mention that Hedgehogs indicates a preparedness to weaken the apparent demandingness of its conception of the ethical responsibility to live well. For example, it suggests that victims of oppression can be forgiven if it is their victimization that prevents them from living with dignity. Suppose it is the case that because of the unjust conditions of patriarchal societies, generations of women have accepted with little reflection or choice a cramped conception of themselves as domestic servants. According to Hedgehogs, we might say that each of these many, many women failed in her responsibility to live well, yet can be excused for their failures. Is this a generous enough response to those whose lives we are evaluating? Being absolved of responsibility for failure is certainly better than not being absolved. Yet the judgment of the failure still stands and still seems harsh. Suppose you encounter a person who for all of his life has been captive to impoverished and oppressive circumstances. Not to worry, you say to him, the failure that is your life is not your fault. Should he be comforted? I think not. Thank you.
Thank you.